What's up, y'all? It's Dr. Paul with a conservation video for Liberty Hill Comics, where I share my passion and over 40 years experience comic book collecting, investing, and conservation with you. Today we are beginning a new comic book conservation project for the channel, but with a twist. We have this well-loved copy of Hulk 180, the first appearance of Wolverine, that belongs to friend of the channel Tony Franklin, that he asked us to evaluate for conservation. We are going to use this comic as a case study of when you should do a full conservation and when it makes more sense to do a traditional clean and press. This book should require no introduction, being the first appearance of Wolverine, who appears in the last panel. While not as coveted as Hulk 181, which includes an epic battle between the Hulk, Wolverine, and Wendigo, and has Wolverine's first cover appearance, the value of this once affordable book really took off during the pandemic, and it's become quite a valuable book in its own right. While this is obviously a comic book with numerous flaws, to put it in perspective, a slabbed 3.0 Universal has a fair market value of $450. A 3.5 has a fair market value of $500. A 4.0 has a fair market value of $550. A 4.5 has a fair market value of $625. And a 5.0 has a fair market value of $700, even in today's down market. Whenever we start a new conservation project, we always use my 9-step process for comic book conservation. So let's do a walkthrough of the book as the first step in assessing the current condition and evaluating it as a conservation project. Make sure you have clean and dry hands when you handle your friends' comic books. Initial impression is this is a pretty solid book, even though it's well loved. It's not in tatters, it's not missing anything, it doesn't have any rips, and it has good bones. The staples are solid, the paper around the staples are solid. It does have some stains, so it's had some water damage. You see at the bottom of the cover here and the first wrap, there are some tide mark type water stains. They weren't really obvious from the cover, the exterior of the cover. Let's see how many wraps have these same stains. That's the back of the first wrap. There's the second wrap. Looks like it doesn't go much further than this wrap. By there we're clean. So let's just count how many wraps. If we were going to do a full conservation, we need to do the cover, the first wrap, second wrap, and the third wrap to make sure that that stain is completely eradicated. There's also a crease on the bottom right corner that goes through essentially the entire book, but otherwise the interior looks nice, certainly so far. Beautiful Herb Trimpe art. Let's check out the centerfold staples. They look pretty good. Top one has some staining from some rust infiltration, but pretty minor. It's not the kind of rust that's heavy enough where it threatens the stability of the staple. Alright, I have a few things to say here. Firstly, the Hulk's letter page logo from this era has always struck me in the name and the iconography as sort of scrotal. And I've always wondered if this was on purpose from the writers and the editor. If not, it seems like a mess. The other thing I want to point out here is this book has its Marvel value stamp, For those of you that don't know a lot about these, I did an unboxing recently and did sort of a deep dive into this program and what it means, and you might want to check that out. I'll provide a link. So it's nice to see that stamp intact. Other than the general wear and tear on the front cover, the water stain on the bottom of the first 3 wraps. Look at this beautiful Herb Trimpe art. That's pretty epic. Love it. And the mild rust infiltration, migration from the top staple. I think this book is in pretty good shape. I think with the stains as it sits and there's the shot we're all waiting for. First appearance of the Wolverine. Pretty excellent. Excellent book. Love this little comic book. The back has a fair amount of soiling that's going to have to be addressed. And as I was saying, my assessment, condition of the book right now, with the stains, the soiling, the folds, bends, creases, etc. that we can address with a dry clean. I think the book sits right now at about a 3.5, maybe a 4. Be a stretch. I'm going to wipe down the cover with a cotton round, and while this blurs the distinction between evaluation and cleaning, one of the reasons I'm going to do it is because I'm going to see how much soiling will come up and or whether or not I lift any ink doing this. And so I sometimes include this in my assessment of the book. Regular viewers of the channel will know that if you are paying attention with a cotton round, you can feel imperfections in the paper, you can feel inclusions in the book, you can feel adhesions or other foreign substances on the surface of the book. So, fair amount of soiling. I wouldn't bet my life that there wasn't a little bit of ink lift with that cotton round, gentle as it was. So there's some work to be done on this front cover. Let's check the gloss and the bends, folds that will be addressable with a press. I'm going to use now the clean side of this cotton round, and I'm going to do the same on the back cover. Again, just as part of my assessment, this will help me find any foreign substance, foreign bodies that are sitting on top of the book. That's why this is sometimes included in my assessment. With a book like this, that's seen a lot of love, been read quite a few times, it's always worth checking that there isn't some foreign body on the cover. Let's check the... Looks like a similar amount to the front cover, and before I move on too far from the statement I made earlier about lifting a little bit of ink, with the cotton round you can buff the surface. When I say remove a little bit of ink, we're talking microns, typically not an amount that you will see. Here's some soiling that I'm just feeling to see if it's adhesions on the cover or just regular soiling. And that tiny amount of ink that you remove actually can remove the top layer of ink that's oxidized. Now I'm checking it in raking light, see what kind of defects I can see. I'm checking the spine. And by buffing off the top couple of microns, you can actually brighten the ink up. So rather than fade it by removing a little bit, you actually enhance it by removing a little bit, similar to polishing a car with an oxidized paint job. for those of you that have been around for a little while, remember back in the day, it's not really a thing so much with clear coat anymore. So my assessment is this is a solid little book. Depending on how hard you want to hit it for the stains, it's somewhere between a 3.5 and a 4 in my estimation. And there are some pressable and cleanable defects here that we can certainly address. This soiling being removed will improve the presentation quite a bit. There are some dents, creases, and folds that can be addressed with a simple dry clean. A conservation could mitigate or completely remove the stain on the cover and the first 3 wraps, but would also involve some risks. And so I think there's a conversation to be had here. So before we decide our course of action with this comic book, let's discuss something that may not be discussed enough in our community: the risks of comic book conservation work. I find in life generally taking an approach of balancing risks and potential benefits often leads to improved outcomes. So let's discuss the potential risks of using conservation techniques like a full aqueous bath to treat the water stains present on this book. The biggest risk is, of course, damaging the book. Broadly, there are 3 elements that could suffer damage from our conservation efforts: the paper, the inks, which conservators broadly refer to as the media, and the staples that hold our saddle-stitched book together. We could get more precise by talking specifically about areas of each that are prone to damage, like the staple holes in the wraps, for example. But for our conversation today, that's not necessary. No matter how tried and true a method is, no matter how careful we are, and no matter how experienced we are, there is some inherent risk in applying conservation techniques to comic books. We are human after all and make occasional miscalculations, errors in judgment, and missteps. Also, occasionally life interferes with a comic book conservation task and compromises your outcome no matter how much effort you put into controlling for it. There's also some variability to how these comic books respond to conservation efforts, and we don't know the complete history of these books, which adds to the risk of some of our techniques, because a technique that gave us a great outcome with one comic book can occasionally give us a disastrous result with another seemingly identical book. Then there is the risk associated with sending a book that you have performed work on off for grading and getting either a conserved or restored label, whether your work warrants it or not. The grading companies are in a state of adapting to the growth in cleaning and pressing, and especially the growth in heat overlay pressing, which involves a wet overlay, and blue LED photo bleaching, which is very often performed in conjunction with chemical bleaching using hydrogen peroxide. In their attempts to adapt, the grading companies are hitting more books with both conserved and restored labels, and these distinctions are not always consistent. There are many examples of folks performing the exact same process on a batch of comics and having 3/4 of them returned in universal labels and the last quarter returned in restored labels, and also of resubmitting those restored label books and having some of them come back universal. Anytime we manipulate a comic book, we risk these outcomes. Lastly, there is the risk that we invest far too much time and resources into a comic book to justify the outcome. My time is valuable, and spending 6 hours turning a 6.0 into an 8.0 for a comic book that is only worth $20 in near mint condition does not make economic sense. All of these risks should always be weighed against the potential benefits of comic book conservation. So when does comic book conservation make sense? I've summarized when it makes sense to me into 3 broad categories. The first is when a defect is present that threatens the preservation of the comic book. This includes conditions like badly tanned paper that is spiraling into acid-catalyzed hydrolysis, which we could arrest by deacidifying the paper. The second is when a defect is present that threatens the use of the comic. Examples of this condition include a torn page or weak paper around the staples that are likely to be further damaged if we attempt to read the comic book. And lastly, when an otherwise higher grade and high value book is held back by a defect we could address. This is basically the financial incentive. Sometimes we have a book that presents us with more than one of these incentives. These are, of course, the best conservation candidates. So given this risk-benefit approach to conservation, what should our course of action be with this copy of Hulk 180? There aren't any defects threatening either the preservation or the use of the book. Although it has staining, the paper is supple, the book has solid structure, and is very readable. It's also slated for slabbing, so it's unlikely to be read or suffer imperfect storage conditions in the near future. So let's discuss the potential financial benefit. As I stated, I think as is, this book is about a 3.5 or 4.0 at best. I think a simple dry clean and press is going to bring this book up into the 4.0 to 4.5 range. A full conservation with stain removal probably doesn't lift it above a 4.5, frankly, because it's held back by the numerous bends, creases, cover wear, and other general defects. At best, we might hope for a 5.0 after full conservation, but I don't think it quite gets there. So the potential benefit of a full conservation over a dry clean and press, we are estimating as 0.5 points at most. Let's weigh that against the risks. Firstly, we could damage the comic book and have it grade out at an even lower grade than if we did nothing at all. While the risks of this are low, they are non-zero and should be considered. More likely, though, we could be hit with a deserved conserved label or an undeserved restored label. These risks would hit the owner in the wallet pretty hard, to the tune of hundreds of dollars of equity, because conserved label comics sell at a modest discount to Universal, and restored label comics sell at a significant discount to Universal label. Let's dig deeper into the specifics of the risk-benefit analysis. Remember, we have the cover and the first 3 wraps stained. So to address these, we're going to have to disassemble the book and do a full aqueous bath with 4 total wraps. This takes days of our time, and there are material costs and opportunity costs as well. There is also a chance we have a significant whitening of the first few pages, after which they no longer match the rest of the wraps, and we end up wet cleaning all of the wraps to make them match. This can easily tie up our hobbyist conservation studio for a few weeks. And the more manipulation of wet paper we perform, the greater the risk of damage as well. Our estimated best outcome for this work is a bump of 0.5, which represents an increase in fair market value of only $75. Weigh this against the possibility of damaging the book further or getting a conserved or restored label, which would result in the loss of hundreds of dollars of equity. And to me, this is a perfect example of a book that should not be conserved, but rather get a simple dry clean and press and be sent off to CGC. Tony entrusted me with the decision, so here is my conservation plan for this comic book. We're going to do a straightforward dry clean and press and submit this book to CGC for grading in the vintage tier. I think we can potentially increase the equity of this book to, say, $625, the fair market value of an estimated 4.5 grade that I think we can achieve, which is approximately double what Tony will have invested in the book. And we can do this with very minimal risk and investment of time and resources. So, next video, we'll get to work dry cleaning this book. I hope you enjoyed this video on when to conserve and perhaps when not to conserve a comic book. What do you think of my assessment? Would you add anything to my assessment process? What would you do if this comic book was yours? Let me know in the comments below. I want to thank Tony for entrusting me with his book, the one true first appearance of Wolverine. For those of you who don't know Tony Franklin, he's a comic book creator, among other things, and I encourage you to check out his work. I'll provide links in the description to his latest efforts. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out our Facebook group, the Comic Book Conservation Community, for more content. And until next time, take care of one another.